For who can be so ignorant or indolent to be uninterested by what means and under what form of government the Romans, in less than 53 years, have conquered almost the whole inhabited world, a deed without precedent in history? And who is there so inflamed by other manifestations of study or spectacle that regards anything to be of greater moment than the acquisition of this knowledge? Roman politics has long held the interest of ancient and modern spectators for its organization, effectiveness, and, in some cases, brutality. Over the course of almost 2,000 years of Rome's existence, its political institutions allowed them to dominate the Mediterranean world. From kingdom to republic to empire, the political systems that kept Rome ahead of its rivals evolved countless times to the ever-changing world around it, sometimes with devastating consequences. Welcome back to another episode on Roman civilization. In this episode, we will explore the political institutions of the Roman Republican Senate, how it functioned, and what role it served. It will then, if applicable, be compared to their counterparts and descendants in the Eastern Roman Empire.
Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job.
The Roman Senate was the embodiment of Rome's will. It was a complex structure that had been built over the course of centuries of wisdom, which began with the end of the Kingdom of Rome in 509 BC and lasted until 27 BC, when Augustus ascended to the Imperial throne. During this period, the city of Rome did not have its own dedicated written constitution, unlike cities throughout the Republic's sphere of influence, which had codified laws written for their governance. Instead, Rome's unwritten constitution was named the res publica, the public thing, which also gave rise to the modern word of republic. One of the first key moments in the Republic's storied political history was the expulsion of Rome's last king, traditionally dated to 509 BC. The system that replaced the monarchy were annually appointed magistrates, along with 2 consuls who shared office for 1 year and would each hold elections for their successors in due course. From the very beginning of the Republic, principles were established that excluded the potential for the consuls to declare themselves king. These principles were a fixed term of office, having to share the office with a colleague, and the need for elections to be held by the current seat. For the next several centuries, Rome largely operated within this political framework and was more or less unchanged. From the top down, the republican system began with the dictator, which was only ever employed in emergencies and held office only for a period of 6 months. Below him was the magister equitum, or the master of horse. This position, like the dictator, was held for 6 months in cases of emergencies and was used in times of crisis. Next were the magistrates, which consisted of 2 consuls, anywhere between 4 and 20 state treasurers known as quaestors. Under them were 2 to 8 praetors, usually in a military position, and the next layer down consisted of 2 curule aediles and 2 plebeian aediles, who were responsible for the construction of public works and games, as well as 2 to 10 plebeian tribunes. All of these positions served in their roles for 1 year before elections occurred again. In addition to these elected positions, there was the Senate. 300 of Rome's wealthiest aristocracy, who were appointed by the consuls and later the censors, who in turn were elected by the Centuriate Assembly. The Centuriate Assembly was formed of 193 centuries of Rome's citizens eligible to vote. Each century was organized according to wealth. 18 of these centuries were classed as equestrian rank, 170 were classed as infantry, and 5 were classed as miscellaneous or unarmored. Every 5 years, the census, a magistrate who served in office for 18 months, was responsible for maintaining the census and would classify eligible citizens into these 193 centuries. These classes additionally relate directly to the military structure of the Republic, as they determined the quality of gear a citizen could obtain, which in turn led to their classification in the triplex assis formation during deployment in battle. It wasn't until the 1st century BC that the Republican political structure began to crack. Enter Tiberius and Gaius Gracchi. Both brothers served as plebeian tribune in 133 BC and 122 to 121 BC, respectively. Tiberius passed legislation which established a commission to survey Roman public land and redistribute the land to poor rural farmers who had been bought out by Rome's wealthier classes. Gaius's reforms aimed to further bolster his brother's reforms, and additionally encourage Roman colonization outside of Italy. Unsurprisingly, both Tiberius and Gaius were received well by the common citizenry, but poorly by the wealthier classes. Both brothers were killed shortly after their terms of office. Tiberius was bludgeoned to death, and Gaius was killed by a combined force of militia and Cretan archers. Their land reforms had aimed to improve Rome's economic and population prospects. Instead, the legacy of their deaths created an avenue for political violence, which became increasingly acceptable as a solution to solve disputes. Their deaths have been marked as the beginning of the end for the Republic and the ruling Senate. The next great period of political change occurred during the career of Gaius Marius, who lived between 157 BC and 86 BC. This famous general has often been attributed with the so-called Marian reforms of the Roman army, which shifted the army from a state militia to professional soldiery. However, this has generally been viewed as a construct of modern scholarship, and has recently been reconsidered. Marius was elected consul for an unprecedented 7 times, which had far-reaching political implications. Prior to his conflict with Sulla, Marius's most significant impact on the political structure of the Republic was the killings committed against his former allies, Saturnius and Glaucia, who were properly elected officials. These killings continued the normalization of violence that began with the Gracchi, and were used to preserve the position of the Senate. The systems of the Republic were collapsing beneath them. Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, 138 to 78 BC, was the first Roman in history to seize power by force. He had risen to prominence as a gifted military commander under Marius's command during the wars against Jugurtha in Numidia in 112 to 106 BC and the Social War in 91 to 88 BC. Following his successful rise in the military, Sulla was awarded the command against Mithridates of Pontus during what would be known as the First Mithridatic War of 89 to 85 BC. However, jealous of Sulla's rise to prominence, Marius stole the command for himself. Unsurprisingly, this enraged Sulla, and for the first time in Roman history, a general marched on the city. The Senate was in a state of panic. In an emergency embassy, a demand was sent to Sulla to explain why he was marching on Rome. Sulla responded by claiming he was freeing the city from tyrants. In an interesting twist of events, Marius and his supporters went about the city, killing many of Sulla's supporters and plundering their properties. Senatorial control in the Republic was waning. At this point in time, Rome had no troops to defend itself. As a result, Sulla entered the city unopposed, though he faced some difficulties from its citizens. He quickly summoned a Senate meeting and induced them to outlaw Marius and 11 other citizens, one of whom was executed after being betrayed by a slave. Less than a decade later, Sulla emerged victorious from his civil war against the Marian faction and enacted a series of reforms that altered the structure of the Roman constitution. Sulla expanded the number of senators from 300 to as many as 600 members, with the new senators recruited from the nobles of Italian towns who had recently been granted Roman citizenship following their objective victory in the Social War. He also increased the number of quaestors each year from 8 to 20, and increased the number of permanent courts to 7, each managed by a praetor. His goal was to lessen the impact of bribery. However, in doing so, he turned the Senate into a two-tier centralized system that kept the powerful, wealthy citizens together and separated those who served in the lower echelons of Roman politics. Previously, the Senate was composed of people recognized for their achievements and personal character. Some have described Sulla's reforms as rendering the Senate less effective as a governing body, too large for meaningful debate, and less able to take decisive action than had previously been possible. The Senate, along with the tribunes and magistracies, also lost their effectiveness as they often now had competing priorities. However, it was not the impact of Sulla, but the next 50 years after him, that would prove to be the most disastrous for the death of the Republican constitution. Beginning in 62 BC, Pompey the Great's victorious return from Asia had become unsuccessful due to the Senate failing to ratify the arrangements of land for Pompey's veterans. Sensing an opportunity to diminish his own great personal debt, Julius Caesar joined forces with Pompey and Rome's wealthiest man, Marcus Licinius Crassus, in a private agreement that would become the first triumvirate. This agreement between the three, ratified in the Italian town of Lucca, gave Pompey the land he needed for his veterans, a guaranteed consulship for Caesar, followed by governor of Gaul for 5 years, and a promised consulship for Crassus at a later date. Over the next several years, Caesar's political maneuvering played out exactly as he had hoped. Pompey's rivalry with Publius Clodius Pulcher devolved into attacks on the city by armed gangs, which brought in the expected military response from Pompey. Pompey then further pushed through laws that recalled Cicero from his exile and, showing his political ineptitude, was overridden by the Senate, which rescinded the land laws for his veterans. This particular move by the Senate forced the renewal of the triumvirate, where Caesar was granted a further 5 years as governor of Gaul, effectively giving him political immunity. By 52 BC, a terrifying wave of political violence and corruption had swept through Rome. Clodius was killed in a gang war, Crassus was killed at the Battle of Carrhae, and Caesar's daughter, who was married to Pompey, had died in childbirth. The stage was set for civil war. In 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his veteran army and marched on Rome. Pompey, who had been granted dictatorial powers alongside the Senate, abandoned Rome for Greece, and Caesar entered the city unopposed, much like Sulla had done 39 years earlier. Caesar quickly set about reforming the machinery of the Republic, which had broken under the weight of its own imperialism. The Senate had effectively become powerless. The provinces were governed as separate principalities under the absolute control of their governors instead of reporting back to the Senate, and the army had replaced the constitution as the main means of achieving political goals. Caesar's reforms of the structure of the Republic had 3 main goals: suppress all armed resistance in the provinces, create a strong central government in Rome, and redesign the lands of the Republic to function as a single cohesive unit. To do this, he increased the number of magistrates elected each year, which greatly increased the pool of experienced magistrates. He then began the transformation process of Italy into a single province. Further, he linked the provinces to Italy through the appointment of experienced magistrates who had direct loyalty to Caesar. These reforms were completed under his successor, the first emperor, Augustus. Caesar additionally raised the membership of the Senate to 900. In terms of political power, Caesar held both the dictatorship and the plebeian tribunate, both of which were granted for life. The plebeian tribunate made Caesar's person sacrosanct and allowed him to veto the Senate. He continually passed new laws that stopped any opposition from attaining any political position of prominence. One law subjected governors to term limits, another granted him the right to appoint his own magistrates, consuls, and tribunes, effectively transforming those previously lauded positions into representatives of the dictator, and further robbed the popular assemblies of their last shreds of influence. Politically, the Republic was effectively dead, replaced by an empire in all but name. Unsurprisingly, Caesar's opposition weren't particularly fond of these changes, and they assassinated him on the Senate floor on the 15th of March, 44 BC. The resulting political turmoil confirmed the death of the Republic and the beginnings of a new state of power. Enter Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, primus princeps, and adopted son of Julius Caesar. Alongside Mark Antony, Caesar's master of horse, and Marcus Lepidus, the three formed an alliance that became known as the Second Triumvirate. Mirroring the first, they held powers nearly identical to the powers of Caesar, leaving the Senate and popular assemblies utterly powerless. Caesar's assassins were hunted down and defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, leaving the entirety of the Republic to the rule of three. Augustus was given Italy and the West, Antony received Greece, Egypt, and the East, and Lepidus was given command of Africa. Through these divisions of dictatorial command, Lepidus became powerless, and eventually Augustus and Antony battled against each other, and Antony lost at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Augustus returned to Rome victorious, and was the unchallenged master of the state. In 27 BC, he offered to return his dictatorial powers, which he had held since 42 BC, but the Senate refused, allowing him to keep his position for life. This ratification created the first Roman emperor, Augustus, and the final transition of republic to empire. This snapshot of Republican political history is brief, covering a sample of the significant moments of Rome's storied history. The twilight years of the Republic are worth an entire book by themselves. By the time the Eastern Roman Empire, more commonly known as the Byzantine Empire, the political structure had shifted back towards the style of the Kingdom of Rome that existed almost 1,000 years earlier. The Senate of the Byzantine Empire was institutionalized by Constantine the Great, who reigned as emperor between 306 to 337 AD, and initially consisted of Roman citizens who happened to live in the East. Constantine's son, Constantius, raised its position from municipal to an imperial power, but effectively had the same limited capabilities as their Roman counterparts. At the head of the Eastern Roman Empire's Senate structure was the emperor. The emperor was the divine incarnation of the law, who oversaw the multi-ethnic empire that governed the Eastern Mediterranean. He was the ultimate holder of power, and the sole administrator and lawgiver of the empire, with power over the state, land, and subjects, which he had been given through God's appointment as king. Under the emperor stood the Senate. In essence, the Byzantine Senate was a continuation of the Imperial Senate, which in turn was a continuation of the Republican Senate. However, the Senate that stood in Constantinople was founded in the 4th century AD, when the capital of the empire was moved from Rome by Constantine the Great. That's where the similarities with the Republican Senate end. The offices of aedile and tribune had long since disappeared, and the quaestor was on the verge of falling into redundancy. Beneath the emperor, court functionaries and officials, all directly chosen by the emperor or by one of his representatives, operated the empire's administrative and military needs. Many senators were less distinguished and less affluent than those in the West, and more than their Republican predecessors. The Senate was allowed to pass resolutions, which they presented to the emperor as suggestions on imperial legislation, which the emperor could then issue in the form of edicts. This was effectively the limit of their powers. The Senate was utilized for trials of high treason and as a judicial court, which consisted of 5 senators at a time chosen to judge on ordinary crimes. Their last similarity with the Republican Senate was their constitutional significance on the laws of succession. The Eastern Roman Empire did not have any codified laws on succession, nor was the concept of the Republic ever abolished in the East. In theory, each emperor was elected by both the Senate and the army. In practice, however, much like the Senate during Augustus's reign, it had lost most of its former powers. It was mostly left to a ceremonial role, filled with installed relatives or rich aristocrats by the emperor, to keep power for himself. Instead, succession was secured through several different methods, typically through the appointment of heirs as co-emperors, establishing dynasties of successive rulers. Aside from the Senate, any remnants of the Republican political institutions had long since ceased to exist. The Byzantine administrative system had evolved and developed to such an extent that it would no longer be recognizable to a Republican politician. It is clear that although the Eastern Roman Empire was the successor of the Republic and the Western Roman Empire, their political system had evolved and changed to such an extent that the only thing left behind of the Republic was its history. Sadly, by the crisis of the 4th century AD, the ancient and noble office of the Senate, which had been founded 2,000 years prior by Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, finally vanished to the pages of history. Despite the Eastern Roman Empire carrying on the names and traditions of their Republican ancestors, there is little Republican influence on the workings or structure of the empire. It had changed so much and gone through so many iterations and amendments that what existed during the empire would have caused many Republican senators to look upon it in disdain. The unity that the Mediterranean Republic encompassed had long since disappeared. Byzantium's breaches between its central government and outer territories helped speed its demise in the east. In the west, the squabbling remnants of the Western Roman Empire ensured the alienation of the Eastern Empire through the division of the churches and the slow detachment of cultural identities. The Eastern Roman Empire was its own empire, with its own institutions and problems. Their Senate carried the name of their esteemed ancestors, but nothing more. More videos on the life and society of the ancient Romans are on the way. To make sure you don't miss it, please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.